hear me okay? Really excited to get this winter webinar series on the road. So hello, everybody. Welcome to the 2022 Small Farms Winter Webinar Series, hosted by University of Illinois Extension's Local Food Systems and Small Farms team. My name is Nick Frillman, and I'm the Local Food Systems and Small Farms educator in Livingston, McLean, and Woodford counties, and I'm your moderator for today's session. We appreciate you joining us for these webinars, and we will do our best to begin and end within the space of your lunch hour. It is difficult for our experts to deliver in-depth, actionable information in 1 hour. So please put your questions in the chat box during the presentation, and we'll do our best to make sure as many questions as possible are answered at the end of the presentation. We'll plan to break at about the 10 till 1 p.m. mark for questions. So if you think of anything, put it in the chat box. And we were kindly provided a bio from Savanna Institute, our speaker for this week's presentation, or a group of speakers, I should say. And so the Savanna Institute is a nonprofit organization based in Illinois and Wisconsin that works to lay the groundwork for widespread agroforestry adoption in the Midwest US. Inspired by the native savanna ecosystems that once covered much of this region, the Savanna Institute conducts research, education, and on-the-ground demonstrations to support the growth of diverse perennial agroecosystems. All right, and with that, we'll go ahead and get started with our speaker.
Thank you so much, Grant, Nick, and U of I Extension for inviting the Savanna Institute to present today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, does that look great for everyone?
It does.
Perfect. Well, thanks again for inviting us to share, to talk about practical agroforestry for Illinois small farms. Before we get started, I just want to invite folks to open the native land map that I'm going to try to link in the chat here, but you can Google it pretty easily and enter your location, as we take a moment to acknowledge the communities that we're deeply connected to in the unceded land on which you live. So the Savanna Institute Illinois demonstration farms, as well as many of the farm landscapes we're going to talk about today, grow on the unceded lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Muscotan, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw peoples. The soil we work with and the nourishment it provides are rich only because of generations of land stewardship. This land continues to carry stories, fight for survival and identity, and celebrations of resilience and joy. It is our obligation as agroforesters not only to acknowledge this past, but actively support, listen to, and amplify the rights and demands of Indigenous communities. So my name is Kaitie Adams, and I am a guest on these unceded lands and work as the Illinois Community Agroforestry here at the Savanna Institute. And my role is mostly associated with education and outreach, specifically through our demonstration farm program, to show folks what's possible with using trees on agricultural landscapes. And then I'll let Sven and Eric introduce themselves. Sven? Eric? Oh, I think that Sven and Eric are also muted, so I'll go ahead and introduce them, and then we can make sure that they're muted for the rest of the presentation. So Sven is our Illinois Technical Service Provider, and he is based in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, like I am, and works more on the agroforestry technical side of things, as well as really focused on really good designs for agroforestry on a multitude of landscapes. And Eric Wolske is our farm establishment lead, and he works on looking at the ways that our equipment, our systems, and the systems that are already in place on farms can all work together to provide a connected landscape of agroforestry in central Illinois and beyond. And you'll be hearing from each of them throughout the presentation. So Nick did a great introduction to Savanna Institute, but I just wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about who we are and what we do. Our work is focused on about 3 different spheres. This first sphere is really focused on tree crops. So what are the trees and cropping systems that are going to be resilient and productive for Illinois, Wisconsin, and the greater Midwest? And we do this through research on the crops themselves, breeding work, variety trials, as well as some commercialization work, because we need strong, robust markets for the crops that we're growing. The second is on farming systems. So this is where our demonstration farm network becomes super vital, because we want to be able to show folks what's possible on different soils in different locations and with different ecosystems, so that we can see how those things can be set up in different places. And so folks can come out and see what's working, what's not, and then we can provide good landscapes for education. And the third is more of our education and outreach work. So we work with a diverse set of stakeholders to ensure that folks have good information and are able to mobilize it. So we run an apprenticeship program that pairs beginning farmers with mentor farms. We do a lot of workshops and webinars and host a perennial farm gathering and try to bring together researchers, industry builders, farmers, and landowners to make sure agroforestry is successful where we are. So why agroforestry? Why trees on agricultural lands? Well, one of the big things is that we have these very particular ideas of what agriculture is, what conservation is, and what the natural world is. So if we think about the ways that our landscapes are set up now, it's agriculture is in one sphere, conservation is on the edge or in a different place, and nature is something that happens way off to the side. It's not something that seems to impact agriculture in any way, shape, or form, but in reality, all 3 of these things are combined. And for healthy soils, healthy waters, and ecosystems, they need to be all in equilibrium and balanced. So what agroforestry does is really gets at the root of the matter of these divisions. So we're looking to plant trees to put perennial roots in the ground that can capture nutrients, stabilize soil, and then lead to minimal pesticide use over time because ecosystems are imbalanced. And this is really to help address some of the issues that we're facing on our landscapes and in our soils, such as erosion, nitrogen and phosphorus water pollution, which is actually increasing in the state of Illinois instead of decreasing, and pesticide toxicity that comes through both soil, water, and air drift. So when we talk about agroforestry and the use of trees, we're really looking at something that's transformative. So we're looking to move from annual production to perennial production, from herbaceous cropping systems or solely herbaceous cropping systems to woody cropping systems or systems that incorporate woody plants within that. We're really looking to move from monocultures, so one crop growing in one place for one season, to polycultures, where we have multiple species on one farm landscape, whether that be a mix of perennial and herbaceous crops or all perennial crops, but lots of different species in one sphere. And, to go from an open system where we're putting a lot of inputs from the outside onto our farm landscapes to more closed systems so that we can start to utilize the resources that are on the landscape, build those up so that they can be used within their own ecosystems. So agroforestry, very simply put, is the integration of trees within agriculture. And there's a lot of different ways to define this. So agroforestry is the original form of agriculture. Agriculture started as forest gardens. So as folks moved from solely kind of hunting and gathering, they started to grow and cultivate and select things from forest stands or grasslands. And so agriculture really sprung up out of, the edges of forests, and sometimes in areas where you were clearing forested land. So we had trees at the basis of all agriculture. But the USDA defines agroforestry within the realm of 5 particular practices. So these are practices that are supported through research and funding by the USDA. So we're going to focus on some of those here, but just know that agroforestry is ancient, it's indigenous, and it's practiced in thousands and thousands of different ways around the world. So the first practice we're going to focus on are windbreaks. So this is the use of trees and woody crops to protect farmland, to protect cropland from drift, to provide buffer zones for wildlife and pollinator activity, and also as spaces of carbon sequestration and soil erosion protection as well. So oftentimes when we look around the landscape, in central Illinois, we don't see windbreaks very often anymore, but they're often 2 rows of evergreens and another row of trees. But you can make windbreaks multifunctional, and I'll talk about that a little bit more throughout the presentation. The second practice is alley cropping. So this is where we're planting trees among annual or perennial cropping systems. So in this infographic here, we see that there's summer annuals happening between rows of trees. So those rows of trees can be timber trees, they can be fruit or nut production trees, they can be trees for floral woody production. But what alley cropping does is allow you to stack 2 different systems onto one landscape. So oftentimes if we're adding perennials to annual systems, that means that you have a short-term return on investment and short-term work paired with long-term return on investment and long-term work. And alley cropping can also provide a good way to transition agriculture over time. So this photo shows us going from summer annuals, so let's say corn or soybeans, to winter annuals such as wheat. And then later, as the tree canopies grow, then we can transition to bringing animals on the landscape to silvopasture. So riparian buffers are the third practice, and this is the use of woody perennials along waterways for bank stabilization and soil erosion, for interconnected wildlife and pollinator corridors and habitats, and mainly for soil or for water quality. So tree roots really can help with filtering things that might be coming off of agricultural landscapes. So phosphorus and nitrogen are the big ones that we look at for riparian buffers, but they're really kind of a line of defense before any of these inputs that we put onto agricultural land hit those waterways and head into our rivers, streams, and eventually down to the Gulf of Mexico. So similar to windbreaks, these can be incredibly multifunctional. So they can be purely conservation or move into more edible or marketable crops. Silvopasture is the fourth one, and this is the introduction of animals into trees. So there's 2 different ways of doing silvopasture, or I should say 2 main categories of silvopasture. The first is what we call silvopasture by addition. So this is planting trees or woodies into already established or establishing pasture, where we're planting trees for soil health, carbon sequestration, planting for shade to really provide some relief from strong summer weather, or in winter, they can provide shelter spaces for animals as well, and can also provide fodder. So that can improve or enhance the diet that's already existing within that pasture. And then the second kind of flip side of that is what we call silvopasture by subtraction. So that's when we're taking a forested or wooded area, and then taking trees out to open up the floor for increased pasture production and for greater health. So silvopasture isn't just, letting animals loose within a forested area. It's more about making sure that you have an intentional system that supports the health of the landscape, the trees that are there, and the animals themselves. So it's very intensive and very intentional. And then the last one is forest farming. So this is the cultivation of crops within wooded and forested areas. So silvopasture can be one of those things, but also we have things like mushroom production that require shade, the cultivation of forest medicinals, so wild ginger or ginseng or blue cohosh, depending on, the forested areas in which you're at, or really utilizing the edges for things that grow well on the side. So when we think about forest edges, we see things like hazelnuts or wild plums or elderberries, things that are really productive on those edge lands and partial shaded areas. And pawpaws, which is my favorite fruit, are also something that's great for forest farming. So we like to see describe agroforestry as a Swiss Army knife. It can do a lot of different things all at once, and it all depends on how we can utilize trees to meet the goals of your landscape and of your farm business. So we'll talk a little bit more as we go through kind of some farm examples, but we do have a list of some top tree crops specifically for Illinois, ones that are, for production, for sale, or fresh eating or processing, and also some timber and conservation trees that we work with for the climes and soils that we have present here in Illinois, which there's people joining from all over, and there's a vast, vast difference in those things depending on where you're at. So the first farm that I'm going to profile is actually not in Illinois, but it's a farm that I'm intimately familiar with since I used to manage it. And that's Earth Dance Organic Farm School in Ferguson, Missouri. And it's an annual vegetable alley cropping system where we were growing all of our annual vegetables in between rows of productive fruit trees and pollinator plants. So we used a permanent bed system, and we're alternating and rotating our crops within that. And we had kind of mowed areas and grassy buffers between the berms where we had fruit trees growing, and then our annual permanent production beds. So this can be a really great option for folks that are already doing diversified vegetable production and wanting to add a different income stream or a different, more perennial element to that. So we found it to be extremely successful, especially because we were farming on an incline. So we had a berm and swale system in place. We were helping capture water to water those trees. And it was really great for beneficial insects as well. So like parasitic wasps can be one of our greatest allies in vegetable production. And we had an amazing population of parasitic wasps and other things that were eating the pests that we were seeing in our annual vegetables. One drawback of this system is that we found it really hard to balance the management of the diversity of fruit trees we had with the amount of annual diversified vegetables we were growing. So we kind of got a little stressed sometimes in making sure that we were managing the trees effectively, as well as managing the vegetables effectively. And then another issue is that we made a huge mistake when we were thinking about weed suppression for these fruit tree berms. We put down landscape fabric and then wood chips, which I would never ever do again in a million years, because what happened was we would have, anytime there was a rip in the landscape fabric or something, there would become a hole, these wood chips would be breaking down and creating this really nice like humus layer, and then weed seeds would germinate, and it would, the weeds would start growing through the fabric. And it was a hard situation. So if you want to talk more, I'd be happy to talk more about the landscape wood chip situation. The second farm is an example of perennial polyculture alley cropping. So this is Saturn Farm in Ogden, Illinois. And the crop that we're growing in the alleys are black currants and rhubarb. And then we're also growing pawpaw and black locust trees as kind of our tree row trees. So the black locust and pawpaw are spaced at 7.5 feet, which is pretty tight. And then we have 12 feet, then we have black currants. And in some areas we have rhubarb or asparagus growing, and then another row of black currants, and then the pawpaw and black locust. So we have upwards of 4 crops growing in one pretty small area, which has been highly productive. Everything is kind of harvested at different times. We have different rates of growth, and we pretty much had an income, even though it's all perennial, we had an income stream starting at year 3, which was great. We specifically use black currants because they produce in up to 50% shade. And Eric Wolske can talk a little bit more about that because he's a black currant expert. And everything was designed so that we could get our mower and our mechanical harvester for the black currants down. So it's been pretty successful in being able to incorporate so many crops into one landscape. However, the thing that's been the hardest part of managing this farm is the weed management itself. So we've really struggled to come up with some good systems of managing weeds in kind of all 3 of these growing systems. So herbicide has been used, heavy mulching has been used, we've done weed whipping, we've done kind of hand weeding, and we're just kind of struggling to get the right weed management across all these different types of crops that have different growing habits. I think one thing that could have hedged our bets on that is better site prep and planning before these crops went in. The third kind of alley cropping system is a conventional row crop alley cropping system with trees. I want to make sure that we have enough time, so I'm actually going to plug a YouTube video that goes into this that I'll link in the chat after I'm done. But these are rows of trees, specifically timber trees, that are planted into a conventional row cropping system. Another use of trees within systems is hedgerows. So this is a hazelnut hedgerow that we have growing out at Allerton Park in one of our demonstration sites. And these are hybrid hazelnuts that have grown incredibly quickly. They've done a really great job of spreading out and keeping the weeds down on the edges of this plot that we're growing in. They're a highly productive crop in this area. They provide really great habitat for birds and pollinators, and they're also just incredibly beautiful. So when we think about hedgerows, hedgerows can be incredibly multifunctional and can serve a similar purpose as windbreaks, but it's often kind of middle story or shrubby plants that we put into hedgerows in this system. So happy to talk more about hedgerows at the end and answer any questions. And then here's an example of a native kind of polyculture windbreak. This is at Vulcan Farm in Sydney, Illinois. And this has blackberries, black raspberries, hazelnut, plum, cranberry, elderberry, persimmon, juneberry, hybrid poplar, and red cedar. And besides the hybrid poplar and red cedar, everything within this has an edible component, but also has a really great pollinator component as well. So while this windbreak was designed specifically to stop wind and chemical drift, it also has the dual function of being able to harvest a crop from it. It also has a dual purpose of really allowing for some good water saturation on this site. The tree roots have done a really good job of, when we have major rain events in this area of the farm that would flood frequently, we've seen the water recede at much faster rates in this area than when they're in areas where there are not trees present. And then the last one I'm going to talk about is Fields Restored in Oregon, Illinois. This is one of our demonstration farms. And this is an example of a multifunctional edible riparian buffer. So these trees are planted on either side of a waterway and creek. And so this is one that's designed for water quality, aesthetics. So beauty is often a goal that folks have on their landscapes. And it's designed to be beautiful in the springtime with blooms, in the summer with foliage and fruit, and in the winter when things lose their leaves, so it's nice on the landscape. And then there's also some things we can harvest off of it. So red and yellow dogwood, as well as willow, can be harvested for floral needs. Persimmon and American plum and pawpaw and elderberry can be harvested for use or sale. And then, I mean, shagbark hickory can as well. Shagbark hickory syrup's actually incredibly delicious. But we have a variety of plants here that are kind of woody, small shrubby bushes, all the way up to some larger trees such as river birch and shagbark hickory that do well in more of these wet or floodplain areas. And this is an area of the farm that receives significant runoff from both a pasture and from annual row crop production. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sven.
Hello, everyone. So in this slide, this is Triple S Farms from Stewartson, Illinois. And what they are just now implementing basically a hybrid between alley cropping and silvopasture. So I don't know the exact quantity of trees offhand, but we can see them in the image. And they are alternating hay and pasture grass, corn in their alleys, as well as running chicken tractors. I guess you can't see my cursor. Chicken tractors, those little rectangles, and turkey tractors in those alleys. And so in the next slide, we will get into what the specific trees that were planted are. But in the, I have my notes right here in front of me. In the southwest corner, so the bottom left corner, it was a little bit, there's a low area. So the trees planted there handle wet feet, or their roots being in wet soil a little bit better. Again, in the top center, so just to the right of hay, we have got another low and wet spot. And then in the bottom right-hand side, there's another wet spot. So the trees that we're going to look at next were chosen specific or ordered or placed in properly, whether they like wet feet or drier soils. And then from the northeast corner, basically where the top chicken tractor is, down towards the other chicken tractor a little bit more steeply, they've planted fruit trees in there because of the drier soils. Next slide, please. So the crops that they have that they've planted this season, and some of it's very recent. I was speaking to them just the other week, and they were still picking up trees. So 3 varieties of hickory, 3 varieties of pecan, 3 varieties of black walnut, 6 varieties of oak, persimmon, pawpaw, native cherry, native plum, 3 varieties of apple, 2 of pear, 2 of peach. And as I mentioned, within the alleys, both chicken and turkey tractors on pasture grass. They're growing hay for their other livestock, as well as some specialty corn production. And that's it for me in my commentary.
All right, I guess on to my commentary now. So, hi everyone, I'm Eric Wolske. Yeah, I'm also a grad student at the University of Illinois, finishing up my PhD right now. And so this is one of the farms that I've been participating in and managing for the past few years now. This is the woody perennial polyculture at the University of Illinois. This is it's kind of by the Student Sustainable Farm. You can see that in the backdrop there. The species in this one, which was planted in 2012, include Chinese chestnut, Chinese American chestnuts, both interspersed in similar rows, American hazelnuts, apples, black currants, raspberries, and then pasture grass species were planted in between the rows as an alley crop. And I have the spacing listed there. And yeah, sorry, Felix, I actually don't know what the species that we used for this. This was just a standard pasture grass mix that we used to get an idea of what the stocking rate, how many livestock we could support in these systems. And actually in this photo here, you can see that it was beginning to transition off of the pasture grass into another grad student started doing research on intercropping with soybeans and both organic and conventional. So you can see kind of the differences in between those tree rows. And then there's shade structures there that you can see kind of on like the south side of those little vegetated tree squares. And those were my master's research, looking at the shade tolerance of black currants. Because the idea is that as we continue to use these larger overstory crops like Chinese chestnuts, which will eventually be shading out quite a fair portion of the soil below, we need some crops that could still be producing in the understory. And so the black currants we found to be quite shade tolerant and could actually do up to about 65% shade and still produce favorably. So that was some very good research there. But while doing this, we did find some issues with sort of the management style of these systems. And some of them, I guess, were kind of already mentioned here in the comments, is like weed control becomes a very big issue, as well as pest control when you have plants that are mixed in between one another. I guess go ahead and go on the next slide, Kaitie. And so here we have the different layers that kind of show that, within a row, you could have these different vertical stacking functions, and where you can kind of put in different plants and crops. And this works well, except for when you have to go in to manage, let's say the apple has a disease that's coming on it, and the chestnut does not, you still have to manage that disease on the apple trees. So if you have to spray some sort of fungicide or insecticide, it might not be labeled for that chestnut, or it might actually not be beneficial. And the weed management is also becomes a big deal. Let's go to the next slide. So here's my issues slide. So you can really see well the currants in with the chestnuts there, and how tight the spacing is. And so that tighter spacing leads to greater disease severity, as many gardeners and farmers know. Light penetration into the canopy, as well as wind movement and air movement, helps reduce disease pressure. And we stack way more functions in here. So the benefit of this is we have windbreaks, but the downside is there's less air penetration into the canopies. And so there's a little more, a little higher humidity in there in those canopies. And so the disease goes a little bit higher. And then the other issue here is that for the currants in particular, we have a machine harvester that we're able to use. Actually, I think Kaitie had a picture of it in the Saturn farm. Photos of that currant harvester being used, and the currants now can't get machine harvested here because there's chestnut trees in the way. So one of the long-term effects of planting out these perennial systems is that things grow, and when you start off with little tree tubes, they get bigger and things can be in the way. And for us, these sites, we used herbicide for time being. And so the chestnuts would have something labeled for herbicide for, let's say, grass control, but it would be a different herbicide for the currants. And so we couldn't spray either within those rows. So those are some bigger issues. And we use 12-foot spacing on the chestnuts in between the rows there, is because eventually we will be thinning out these trees. As you can see, the canopies are beginning to touch, and so at this point, we will be probably thinning either this year or the coming years down to 24-foot spacing, which is more the recommendation. And hopefully they get so big that we'll have to thin them out from there again too. So, and then the other thing too that I feel like needs to just be stated is that these woody perennial polycultures, a lot of times we consider these to be sort of a, one size fit all sort of thing. So, oh, well, we just got to put chestnuts everywhere. And I think that's where you really got to consider the native habitat. And it's all about context. So in our region, we're actually finding that, maybe something more like pecans and black walnut might be a superior tree to plant in our sort of swampier champagne soils compared to the chestnuts, whereas chestnuts might do better in other locations. And so really just consider the native habitat that you have around you. And last slide, I think of mine. This is it. And so just to kind of think about things, so too, is that once again, the perennial systems is something that this is, this tree that we're planting is going to be there for 80 to 120 plus years. And so you have to think about the way the tree is now at a, maybe 10-foot tall tree, and then what it's going to look like when it becomes a 70-foot tall tree. And so that's where, and kind of Felix had a question about the summer annuals versus the winter annuals. You can plant both, especially in the beginning, but when you get towards the end of the overall, life cycle of an agroforestry planting, you have way more shade coverage from those trees. And so summer annuals, in a way, are, they don't have the light penetration because there's a canopy there, whereas winter annuals have more of a season before the leaves on the trees come out. So like a black walnut tree in particular are kind of notorious for being a little bit later in the season in the spring for leaf out. And so there's a lot more time for something like a winter wheat crop to get in that nice early spring light penetration before the trees close canopy. So it's just all something you got to make sure that when you're planting out something like this, that you're not just planting a tree, but you're planting a tree for hundreds of years. And so you have to think in that very long-term mindset when you specifically place these perennial crops.
It's my turn again. This is Sven. I wanted to add to what Eric was just sharing. One of the reasons too for annual crops within your rows of perennials is the ability to maintain income while the perennial crop grows out. And that seems to be very, very important for a lot of farmers that are transitioning. And it's a way to make money even if one isn't necessarily transitioning from annuals to perennials. Okay, so I am the Illinois Agroforestry Technical Service Provider for Savanna Institute. And when working with clients, Kaitie is the community forester. So a client will reach out to the Savanna Institute and we will collect their information, and Kaitie will reach out to them and shares agroforestry resources, schedules an orientation meeting with the client, and collects landscape information and client goals. That information gets passed on to me. I review that collected information. I schedule a site visit and meet with the client. I walk and talk with the client on site, normally for upwards of a couple hours, and really get a feel of them and an understanding of their connection to their landscape. I analyze the biophysical data collected from the site and compare that with client goals and start creating sketches of where it's, looking at aspects of the site where it's wet, where it's dry, where it's full sun, look at different soils, and start basically producing a bubble diagram of what practices should be in what areas of the site. And we go back and forth with the client and come up with an agreed upon plan. That information gets documented in the implementation requirement for that particular practice. So If we've got alley cropping, we've got an IR for alley cropping. We've got silva pasture 1 for that. There's supportive practices. There's practices like tree and shrub site preparation that are that happen before you plant your trees. So these will all be figured out and with the client and then turned into the NRCS. The NRCS reviews that implementation requirement, make sure that it meets their standards. And so this is also like I would go back and forth with the NRCS and then work with the client to make sure that what we're looking at or what we're proposing it can be approved. They enter that into their system, and then we provide ongoing support. At some point in time, that client would be approved through a ranking process, and at a later date, once the planting has been implemented and it's been approved by the NRCS, then they can receive varying amounts of cost share based upon the practice.
So Sven introduced a really great way of how to engage with the Savanna Institute. And if you're in Illinois and you're looking to implement agroforestry and perennial farming practices on your landscape, we are here to help. And Sven and I are committed to making sure that we can work through the process that he laid out, and for folks that are interested, access cost share funding through NRCS. And Sven, there's a lot of questions on NRCS funding, so I'm going to quickly go through this, and maybe we can use that as a jumping point to answer Q&A. But before we go into Q&A, I just wanted to plug a couple other educational resources that we have here at SI. We have online webinars that are going to start up again here very soon that cover a variety of topics, and we've been doing them for years. So I'd like to plug our YouTube channel that has all of our past webinars as well. We have lots of field days and workshops coming up in 2022, including at the Memorial 4-H Demonstration Farm in Monticello at Allerton, the Fields Restored Demonstration Farm up in Oregon, Illinois, and some of the other farm landscapes that were on our presentation today. And we have our perennial farm gathering coming up on the 4th, so in just a week or two. And it's free and open to the public, so head to savannainstitute.org to sign that up. You'll also receive a copy of these slides that have a ton of resources on planning. So how to get started with agroforestry planning and design from us, as well as some of our partners. Sven will talk a little bit more about NRCS supporting practices and how that can tie into agroforestry establishment and production. And then we have some resources on plant material sources, as well as tree crop research and production guides that you'll receive as a handout. So with that, I'd love to open it up to questions for Sven, Eric, and I. And maybe we can start with some of the things in the chat related to NRCS.
That sounds good, Kaitie. Yeah, we could go backwards, I suppose. I was actually just scrolling back up to about the middle where questions started populating in the chat. But yeah, if you'd like to start with NRCS, I'll just work backwards, and I'm sure we'll have lots of time because we're about 8 minutes ahead of schedule. So, all right. So Holly Todd says, is there any benefit to the NRCS involvement with 2 acres? So I guess more broadly, is the NRCS approach something that, you know, smaller growers can consider as well as maybe folks with more acreage?
I'm assuming that this question is for me. I would say yes. It makes sense. There are some that are not interested in working with the government, but working with the NRCS. So when I perform a site visit, I try to get the NRCS out there. Our main goal, and we work oftentimes together, is to also address resource concerns. So this process is not just putting in perennial plants, it's also what resource concerns are on the landscape. That's, water, air, wildlife, plant life, and so on and so forth. And from that, basically all the NRCS practices, of which agroforestry is just a part of, can come into play. But I work primarily with the agroforestry practices. So it's good to have them out there. There's things that they bring to the table that could be missed by me, or there's at times the way they look, and a lot of times this is on the individual NRCS person side, how they look at a problem and how they look at a solution can be beneficial to the entire project. So I would say 2 acres or 100 acres, it makes sense to have the NRCS out there. That doesn't mean you've signed a contract and are now beholden to them. That's just that they're out there as well to help with the analysis of the land and make suggestions.
That makes a lot of sense, especially if, as you all have mentioned, you're tied to your waterways, and your land can have impact on other folks' properties as well. So thanks for that input, Sven. Related to that, I know I'm seeing a lot more questions pop in. I'll try and get to them. Related to that, do your clients have to work with NRCS, or can they do it independently? So if I am interested in signing up for Savanna Institute programs, I'm assuming it's not compulsory to work with the government, but yeah.
No, the technical service provider, so it's kind of twofold. So I'm a technical service provider for Savanna Institute, but I'm also a technical service provider that's an intermediary between the public and the NRCS. And so if a project is 100% privately funded, it is not necessary for somebody to work with the NRCS. That also does give one, at times, more flexibility in how those agroforestry practices are designed, because there's a lot of technicality to the NRCS practice standards.
Right. All right. I'm going to move on from NRCS topics because I see quite a few different topics I'd like to get to. There was one question about perennial undercovers underneath different types of crops. I'm attempting to locate it right now. Why aren't people using perennial undercovers? Clover, bird's foot trefoil, and vetch. I like these under fruit trees, so there's not competition with other grasses. And another person mentioned that they found that strawberries work really well as a perennial undercover. So does the Savanna Institute intentionally utilize understory perennial covers or not?
I can take this one. This is Kaitie. Yeah, we encourage really diverse polycultures of ground cover and undercovers as part of perennial systems. And it's really dependent on your soils, what you're looking to produce, and if you're also wanting to attract wildlife or pollinators or other sort of things into your system. So for example, we're doing a ground cover experiment at the Memorial 4-H alley cropping demonstration farm, looking at native shortgrass prairie species, grasses and forbs, as a ground cover compared to something like Dutch white clover and perennial ryegrass. And we're looking at how these two different ground covers affect tree growth, affect competition. Eventually, we're going to be doing some water quality monitoring and carbon sequestration monitoring there as well. So when we're thinking about what type of ground covers we want, we try to make them as multifunctional as possible. But the big thing we look at is to ensure that the ground cover species are in balance with the tree species that we're working with. So that can be pretty dependent on the species that you're working with within that system. But we are 100% all for as diverse and as diverse a ground cover as possible within that system.
Thanks for that. And And I guess I have, yeah, I definitely have some personal experience trying to fend off the grasses from around my new trees in tree tubes. So yeah, I would also just like slightly caution folks, you know, don't be too um, grass or, you know, undercover forward, especially when you're just planting trees. In my experience, it's good to let that tree have a little bit of a weed free and then mulch layer around that tree, especially in the first year or two of its establishment. I did have one other follow up regarding understory grasses, and is there a list of um, from Orlando, is there a list of popular perennial grasses for agroforestry systems? I'm assuming that'll be one of the links that you'll provide later.
We actually don't have that yet because it's
Okay.
information that we're still compiling from other producers as well as our own research. So I would say that this is like an emerging research topic for us. A lot of folks have done a lot of different things. So this is something that we want to compile a list like that, but we're not there yet.
Great. So stay tuned and subscribe to Savanna Institute's email newsletter or other resources to stay on top of what might be coming out soon, right?
Exactly.
Awesome. I'm going to move on to another question. Why were black locust and hybrid poplar chosen for tree species? I'm interested in this question myself. I know a couple folks who've contacted me recently asking how do they get rid of black locusts. So yeah, would be interested to know.
I can also take this one because they're on landscapes that I actively manage. Both were chosen specifically for how fast they grow. So hybrid poplar and black locust are incredibly quick growing. Black locust is seen as a nuisance species. In some places it's seen as invasive, even though it is native to these areas. And the great thing about black locust is it fills a very particular niche, and that is to come in, establish roots, improve soil quality, and start fixing nitrogen in those soils that have been heavily depleted. And then they have a pretty short lifespan, so they die out after 30 to 40 years, and then allow the original dominant species to reestablish. So black locust can be a really great ally in addressing soil health and erosion issues, and it has a marketable product. So it's one of the hardest of the hardwoods. It is incredibly rot resistant and makes not only amazing fence posts, but also chemical-free timber and lumber for things like decking and outdoor furniture and things like that. So agroforestry is intensively managed and intentional by its very design. So when we put things in like black locusts that are maligned or maligned, that's the actual word, we do so in a way that prevents them from spreading and becoming a nuisance tree. They serve a particular purpose and they have a particular niche. For hybrid poplar, while there are some things you can do with it, including using it to create mulch, if you have the right type of mulcher, as well as pulpwood or, even firewood, even though it's not very good firewood, we put it up because in areas where we want to prevent drift, it's one of the fastest, tallest things we can put in a windbreak first. And like black locust, it's seen as a succession species. So it's not a species that's designed to be on the landscape forever, but to serve a particular purpose in the transition years.
Excellent. I would also like to point out that some of the best honey I've ever had was from a beekeeper, master beekeeper I know that had a couple of hives in a black locust grove. It was excellent and super dark and very interesting honey.
And you can eat the blossoms. Black locust flower fritters are one of the best things on earth.
Wow, that's good to know. I do have a follow-up question on the black locust side of things on my side. Has the Savanna Institute began, well, probably not, but do you all have in the works any plans to experiment with timber harvesting of your hardwood species? I know it's probably a little early and most trees are probably, still growing, haven't reached that point yet, but what is your plan for the timber side of things?
For the demonstration farms, as well as our Spring Green campus farms that are in Wisconsin, we are developing sort of those timber management plans. So we actually rely on the University of Illinois Extension foresters to give us some really good advice on those, particularly on management specifically for timber production. So, our ultimate goals with our demonstration farms is for those to become, they're designed with profitability in mind. So we'll be tracking all the management as well as the profitability of the timber that comes off of those landscapes. But it's down the line.
That's great. Folks, if you have any more questions, we have about 6 minutes left. I'm diligently scrolling through the chat. Feel free to pop it back in if I've missed it so far. Oh, there's a nice long one. Here we go. Does the Savanna Institute provide services to scout land that will support agroforestry for farmers that are planning on buying their own land in the near future? I'm wanting to grow persimmon trees in central Illinois and want to make sure the land I steward can support them.
If you want, I can take that one.
Yeah, that sounds good, Sven.
Sure. So we are developing tree crop suitability maps for Illinois, and I believe that persimmon is on that list. But persimmon is also a native tree in Illinois, and as far as I know, doesn't have some of the same. It doesn't. I'm just trying to think of how to say this. So some of our tree crops have specific soil needs, and persimmons are more forgiving than some of the other trees. And so generally, I would say if you're in central Illinois, your land, this is generally again, would be conducive to growing persimmons. But at the same time, I haven't looked at it recently, and I don't know exactly what you're talking about. But if you were to reach out, we could work to see, especially if it actually has been done, if the area or the land you're looking at is suitable for persimmons. I did want to add something too back to the tree crops and talk about hybrid poplar. They're often used too to dry soils out. They act as hydraulic pumps. So if an area of your windbreak or site is wet, hybrid poplar can be planted there at, let's say it's silva pasture or it's a windbreak or in an alley to help dry that land out.
Great. Thanks for the comments. There are a couple other questions in here. One of them I saw a while ago was, are there any examples of integrating maple syrup operations with agroforestry? And I do have like one resource on that. The Cornell Small Farms Program has a lot of really nice smaller acreage farm resources. And of course, the answer regarding the sugaring maple operations integrated with agroforestry would depend on where you are, because actually in our area, Bloomington Normal, just south of town, we have Funk's Grove maple syrup that have been in operation for over 150 years here. But we are actually one of the southwesternmost areas where sugaring maples do well. So for example, if you were farther south in Illinois or the Midwest than say southwest of Bloomington, that if you were planting sugar maples, they might not do too well. But Savanna Institute folks want to take a crack at that one?
I can speak to that again if that's fine with others.
Yep.
So I am familiar with the folks out at Cornell and working with sugar maple. So sugar maple stands are often called sugar bush. They're generally, a stand of all sugar maples. one can, that the soils that support sugar maples often can also support the production of ginseng. So generally, when we come across a stand of sugar maple, first thing that pops into mind is ginseng production. And so then that system would fall underneath a forest farming practice, which is called multi-story cropping within the language of the NRCS.
Awesome. All right, we have time for one more question, and I've been considering which one I'll take a look at here. And I think I really like this question because I actually do get this a lot. Best tree crop for 1 acre. I love that question, but yeah, what's everyone's opinion on best tree crop for 1 acre? And then we're gonna have to cut it off, folks.
I'll go with this one here. So that's where it comes down to site and location. So, and what your goals are. If you want a nice lumber tree for your grandchildren, I would go with black walnut. If you want a nice nut tree that will be producing in 20 years, go with pecan. If you want a quicker one, maybe go with the pawpaw or something. I think any tree that's going to grow in your area that is native, I would say, is a good tree to grow on an acre. So it's all about, like Nick just said there, it's all about the goals, the site, and the location. So I think at the end of the day, plant to your heart's desire, all the trees.
Great. And also, I think you could fit more than 1 tree on an acre. So, maybe don't put all your eggs in one basket. All right.
Exactly.
Well, thank you, Savanna Institute. It's really been a great time. So I'd like to thank our presenters for the great presentation, sharing their insights into agroforestry production. I'd like also to thank everyone for joining us for this webinar. I hope you got some information that'll help you in your small farm endeavors, hopefully even something you can put into place this winter. Please look for an email from us with a link to the archived webinar on the Illinois Local Foods YouTube channel. And with that, have a great day, and we will see you next week.